So this is John Athayde, everyone. I'm really excited to have John here. I first heard John speak at a Triangle RB meetup in Raleigh in like the 2010s, sometime in the 2010s. He was talking about Rails views, and it was like, oh, this guy's like one of the only people I know that's talking seriously about the view layer. At a time when most people are like, tending more toward back end. I'm like, this is my stuff. This is like what I want. So I remember that distinctly and going home and thinking about views more, particularly because I was definitely a designer moving into development, or like definitely on the front end moving more to back end. And so that always stuck with me. And I've kind of kept my eye on John for a long time. Come to find out, John and I have another shared interest, and that is we both studied permaculture. Permaculture is really cool. If you've never heard of it, it is, you can maybe guess something about it related to agriculture. I actually got my permaculture design certificate in this town. It is actually a thing. I had to go through a 2-week intensive course, and I did that back in 2013 here. And John, where'd you get your PDC?
I did it with Jeff Lawton in 2014.
Jeff Lawton, and that was, he does a bunch of awesome videos on permaculture.
Yeah,
so I was
cool
into
stuff.
him as well, yeah. Now, John has done permaculture practically way more than I have. I've mostly just studied it. But I was really excited because I've always thought about how permaculture relates to software development. And so we were talking, and I was really excited about the possibility of this talk because he'd be the perfect person for it. Anyway, I'm going to let John take it away, but John, thanks for kicking us off today.
Thank you all. Thank you, Jeremy, and also Joe and Mark, the rest of the Blue Ridge team, for having me. I have had this idea in my head as a talk for many years, and I do give Jeremy credit for finally giving me the gentle shove to get it onto Pixels. So my name is John Athayde. I run a brand and UX consultancy called Meticulous, but we spend a whole lot of time in the front end and a lot in the Rails view. You may also know me from such hits as the Rails Guide redesign we did a couple years back, and the 2013 classic, the Rails view, which is grossly out of date now, but I'm going to be working on kind of updating some of that this fall just in public blog posts. I've also worked remote for the vast majority of my career. And while I was at Living Social in 2013, my family bought a 15-acre homestead outside of Charlottesville. It had been a horse farm, and before that it was somebody's shade tree mechanic setup. And there were other uses before that, but the first house was built there in 1950. There were trash pits that we found that had old inkwells and broken plates and all sorts of stuff. And the area was first settled in the 1700s. The oldest thing I could find in the county records talks about the pond at the bottom of our property being an ice pond, like where you cut ice for an ice house. So lots of previous uses. But there's all sorts of things we didn't plan on in figuring out a property, right? A barn we didn't design, fencing we didn't choose, water locations someone else had decided to make. Somebody had planted bamboo in the dam of the pond. That should be a capital offense. It's horrible. We had gravel in the middle of where we wanted the future garden to go, which is where the guy had his shade tree mechanic setup going. Infrastructure was baked in from previous decisions that we had no say in. But my wife summed up our mutual feeling when we looked at the property for the first time, and she said, "I love this land." And a lot of the things we were looking at, she was like, "Oh, I love this house. This is great. I like this room, that thing." And I was just like, "Oh, this is cool. We've got, there's a creek over here and whatnot." So we were very much looking at different places. And this was the first time where we were both like, "Yes, okay." And like I said, the house had been from the 1950s, but it was flipped in 2005. So basically, we had a UI refresh on our house, which didn't fix any of the structural problems. I think you might know where we're going here. So now the first instinct with anything like this, right? You're just like, oh man, this isn't what I want. I'm going to rip it out. Start over. I want literal green field. I'd build it the way I want to have it. But we didn't. I mean, let's be honest, I could barely afford to buy the place in the first place. I couldn't afford to tear down brand new structures the lady had put in 5 years earlier. But also, we didn't really know enough. This was the first time we were living on a farm. I had been in DC Metro since '95. I went to architecture school there, and I've been living in apartments and small houses and doing gardening, but this is a whole different scale, right? This is going from my little fun app to, I'm now serving 10,000 people daily. So we didn't know enough about what was right and wrong. So 12 years later, we currently have 4 goats, a dairy cow who is probably calving as I give this talk, chickens, a greenhouse I designed and built, 2 gardens. We've milked animals. We've made cheese. We weaned our kids on goat milk. And we even tried a pony for a season, which is a fun story for later. However, the goats have found more holes in my fences than I care to admit. I've killed more trees than I have actually made take. And I still dream of an orchard that's only partially established. So the past decade and change has taught me a lot about farming, but it's also seeing the commonalities in all the software work I do. And every code base you inherit is someone else's horse farm, right? So the schema you didn't design. It's the authentication system that nobody fully understands. You got a service object that was written in 2016 and nobody knows what it does exactly, but you know if you take it out, everything blows up. The fencing someone else put in. And often we feel the best solution is to take off and nuke it from orbit. Tabula rasa, start with a clean slate. Let's do a greenfield. You know, I think we should do this in Go microservices with an Elixir main core, and I just made up a new micro JavaScript framework that nobody knows except for me, and that's going to be awesome for the front end. But before we rip anything out, let's observe. So, there we go. So we're going to look at software from a permaculture lens today, and we'll get back to that observation concept here in a moment. But what the heck is permaculture, right? So permaculture is a contraction of permanent agriculture or permanent culture. It's a system where we look at mimicking natural ecosystems, and we want to create sustainable, regenerative human habitats, and I'm going to strike the word agricultural here, systems, just systems for people. It integrates land, resources, people, environments through mutually beneficial strategies, and we're focusing on working with nature rather than against it. So in 2014, like I said, I took my PDC with Jeff Lawton, who is here on the far left, and he was Bill Mollison's student. Bill is there in the middle. This all came out of Australia, fascinatingly enough. So the gentleman on the right is David Holgram, and Bill and David Holgram originate the concept with Permaculture 1, published in 1978. And so they effectively kicked off the practice formally at that point. And it's really fascinating once you start getting into more of the theory side of both of these places. You'll notice here a pattern language up in the upper corner here. And for any of you who have done deep dives in kind of like things that cross into software, Christopher Alexander's work coming from architecture is very heavily referenced in a pattern language. And I did a talk on The Timeless Way of Building, which is the book right before a pattern language, before some of you may have seen a long time ago. It's online and you can go look it up if you want to. But Thinking in Systems by Meadow is another one. And all of these things are talking about how these really complex systems interact with each other. So permaculture has, at its core, we've got 3 ethics and 12 principles. We're only going to be able to touch on about 4 principles here because this is, as Jeremy said, this is a 2-week intensive course to learn those 12 principles and apply them. And so we're doing a really quick survey today. But the 3 ethics here, so care of the earth, care of people, return of surplus, 2 ethics 1 and 2. So you'll hear this written a couple different ways. Some people try to put more political intent on this than maybe is there, but the basic idea is still pretty simple. We want to take care of the earth. We want to be sustainable. We want to steward over extraction. And so you can think about that care for the code base. With care for people, you know, we want to make sure that the systems we're building are taking care of humans. So same way if on a software level, developer experience, sustainable pace, psychological safety, all these things are kind of corollaries. And return of surplus. So some people will make this rhyme, they do earth care, people care, fair share. But return of surplus is a clearer way to put it because it's that the system, anything that's extra goes back into feeding the system and improving the system. So open source, documentation, knowledge sharing, community, this conference, right? These are return of surplus. So things that we've been able to learn or have and do, and we can give back to the community, those all kind of fit in there. So the 12 principles are pretty straightforward. And you can think about how these could be applied to almost anything. Any design of any system can benefit from these 12 principles. But we're going to focus on 4 today. Observe and interact, integrate rather than segregate, design from patterns into details, and use small and slow solutions. And these all work together, all 12 of these. But so like I said, it's that they're only got 30 minutes here. And I thought the gong was actually like, you've got a minute left. It's like Mario when the music goes faster. But thankfully, it's to get us back together. So I don't have to worry about being jumping at the end of this. So let's start with observe and interact. When we talk about this, there's some quotes that I've pulled from the various pieces, Holmgren and Mollison. So the quote is, take time to engage with nature so that we can design solutions that suit our particular situation. So the permaculture rule is before we design anything, we observe the land through a full cycle of seasons. Watch where the water flows, watch where the frost settles, where do animals naturally walk, what grows without our help. These are all important things. In a code base, we want to walk the land before we refactor. So in a busy code base, this might get you a day or two, but you can keep going back as far as you need to. Again, what's changed recently? Like, where's the activity right now? What's happening right now? What's been stable for 2 years? Where does everybody avoid committing or touching? That's kind of where you've got, we'll get to zones here in a little bit. That's like the zone 4, zone 5. That's like the fringe, that's the wilderness. And sometimes that can be great that it's not being touched, and sometimes that can be a problem. But you keep digging back and you'll start seeing patterns emerge. Now, the opposite of this is sitting in your backlog and constantly grooming this and never going out and walking the land, never going out and interacting with the customer. So this is not my Jira board. This is just a screenshot from Atlassian before people start critiquing. But that's, if you're just constantly looking at like, hey, I got a PRD and I'm writing code. I got a PRD and I'm writing code, and you're not getting out there and figuring out this stuff and testing it and playing with it, it can be problematic. And this becomes the end in its own right sometimes in a bad way. So Jason Fried at 37 Signals has kind of the far opposite view of this, and it's like we don't even keep a queue. If a request shows up enough, we'll remember it and we'll fix it, which is I mean, it's worked for them. It may not work for everyone else, but that's worked for them. So those are your two extremes, right? But things that are important do tend to come back up to the top, especially if you're walking by them a lot. So how do you walk by them a lot as a user of the software? Well, we call that dog fooding. So dog fooding is observation, using your own software as a user as much as possible. And that can be difficult sometimes if you don't have the pain that you're building for your user. But this is standing in your own field. This is eating from your own garden. And it can be delicious, or it can be really like, oh my God, this is the worst thing I've ever grown. What happened? Why does the one from the store taste better? Usually not, but sometimes you'd be surprised. And when you have that backlog, it's a factory floor. It's not a garden. It's not really agile. It's very waterfall, right? We're responding to things that have already been planned. So you may have plans for spaces in your code base, but the one thing I've learned about unfinished spaces is that nature will fill them and do it painfully. So these are Jerusalem artichokes, which are a really cool perennial. And I planted 5 little tubers, and 2 years later, they had taken over my entire garden space. So, because I had not put things in there to box them in. So think about that. And then, so like I said, we're going to observe through a full season. So that's a literal, in farming, that's a literal calendar year. So the fascinating thing is sometimes, like if especially in the eastern U.S., one thing that I love to point out to people is that when you have that first snow, you can read the forested landscape in a totally different way than you can in the summer. So looking for things in your software that are patterns of use. When like if you're working with something that's a school-based app, you're going to have a very natural annual cycle, but not everybody has that nice fixed annual cycle. So what are those kind of cycles? Try to identify them and then make sure that you're observing through them. And we can also kind of go historically in a way with code that is more difficult to do on the land. So I can go pull up AppSignal or one of those tools and look at all my exceptions through history and which ones were resolved and which ones are still sitting out there. Maybe they were ignored because it wasn't something that anybody could point to. But we can also go through our Git history. We can see how things have evolved. And that's very difficult to do on the land unless you're physically there. All right, so number 2, integrate rather than segregate. So by putting the right things in the right place, relationships develop between them and they support each other. So in nature, monoculture, where you have one big field of something, is fragile. Field of corn, wheat, any single crop. One pest, one disease, everything kind of goes sideways very quickly. Diversity and integration create resilience in agriculture. Plants that support each other. A lot of different plants will go to different levels and strata of the soil to get nutrients. And so instead of everybody competing at the same level, you've got certain plants that are mining things, bringing them up to the surface and integrating with each other. So some examples of this are putting a nitrogen fixer, like a bean, with a heavy feeder, such as corn. And so the Native Americans you've seen did, in the eastern woodlands, did call the Three Sisters method, where you have corn, you had beans that would grow up the corn stalks and also give nitrogen to the corn itself. And then to cover the land between it, these were done in mounds, they would just grow winter squash. So you'd have big rambling winter squash. So 2011, I'm at Living Social. We are at scale, 150 engineers. We had grown from about 20 to that in maybe a year. There's 4 main teams. Internal Tools is the one that I'm happy to work on. The very talented design team kind of sat as a core external to that and delivered specs. And this is Photoshop era. This is pre-Sketch, pre-Figma. So everything is Photoshop comps. And we're delivering those across to the developers as 11 by 17 PDFs, all with red lines, right? Like classic markup. So 2 separate ecosystems, intentionally separated. I actually was part of an acqui-hire, InfoEther, which was Rich Kilmer, Chad Fowler, Bruce Williams, myself, and there were 15 of us. Came in, we basically doubled engineering overnight. And I did not sit with the design team because I was offended that they didn't touch code, which is kind of silly. But I was like, why don't you write code? Why don't you write the HTML, CSS? They're like, we don't do that. Okay, so I went and was a front-end dev for a while. Lynn Wallenstein and I owned the HTML and CSS for Internal Tools, and I just started changing the designs because it was all stuff that was basically scaffolded, right? Nothing to it design-wise. It functioned, it was fine, but I mean, you think of every scaffold Rails app from, you know, the aughts, where it was like, oh yeah, so you got to do these 7 things. I got to go make this thing, then I come back. I make this thing, I come back. I make this thing, I come back. Now I can actually make the thing I needed to make from a record perspective because all the other pieces in the selects are finally populated. So over 2 years, she and I worked a lot with this. We had a couple other people, but we were touching HTML, CSS, JavaScript, all the design, and we basically built a Ruby gem and a Bower package that was a predecessor to what are now design systems. So it served 30 different apps with the same UI. So every internal tool in Living Social went from this free-for-all to having everything looking like a cohesive piece. And now that integration didn't happen because of better tools or better processes per se. It happened because the wall came down. Lynn and I literally were in the middle of the engineering pod. So in permaculture, we use guilds of plants. The things that are supportive of each other, they also help reduce the pest load. So this is Miracle Farms, and I'm going to say his name wrong. I think it's Stephen Sobiowek. But he mixes trees. So this is an old apple orchard he's taken back over. And so instead of having rows of apples or swaths of apples, he'll go and do apple, pear, or prunus genus, and then a nitrogen fixer. And then he offsets the next row. So it's very hard for a pest to hit an apple tree and just start plowing through the orchard because it's like a wild forest. All things are different. Not only that main story crop, now you go down a level. In between, he's got bushes, and then below that, he's got ground level stuff, and those things are all doing different things. So some are food, some are miners like comfrey or things like that that are pulling up nutrients and being ground cover. And all of this stuff is working together to be a healthier ecosystem. So it may not be as compact or easy to harvest as a straight line apple orchard. However, you're going to get more production in the same amount of space, but it's going to be a dramatic diversity of production. So you can't design those guilds and have them in separate biomes. I mean, the whole point is that we're mixing these things together, right? So most Rails teams are great at building. Design, kind of. Most design teams are great at design, and then you tell them to build, So now AI workflow is changing this, but too many items and too many teams still rely on mega handoffs, right? So here's my design, and the design team's like, peace out, and we hope that it comes out okay. What I've found is that I ended up living squarely in the handoff. And so that has changed a lot of my perspective on that, where now the benefit is that that translation layer exists, and there's integration, and I'm sitting with the engineers, and we're hands-on, we're pairing up, working on that front-end code. And that makes a big difference in how quickly we can get to market and the quality and sustainability of that. So designing from patterns down to details. So the quote here is, by stepping back, we can observe the patterns in nature and society, and these can form the backbones of our design. In permaculture, we start from the macro, the topography, the water flow, the prevailing wind, the solar aspect. These are called sectors in permaculture design. And once we know what the site has regarding these view lines or where the sun's going to be, we can start to explore and make a plan. But this is why we need 12 months on a farm, because your sun's going to change position over the course of the year. When the trees lose all their leaves, the winds will change. Where things happen during the season, when do we get the worst rains? When do we get that last frost? That all changes. So in software, the domain is the topography. Now, if we get that wrong, anything we build on top of it's going to go sideways. But remember, the map is not the territory. So this is not the model files per se, but a larger concept of your understanding of the problem, the entities, the relationships, the rules, the invariants, the language the business actually uses. And active record is awesome, but it's also very seductive, because we can think that the schema is the actual model, but the schema is a representation of a real world model. And for anyone who's tried to model a random system that has grown up in human territory and tried to turn it into a database model, you'll know how quickly you start pulling your hair out. You're like, you have that, what? What edge case? How? Who? So, right, we can generate the scaffold, we can wire up a form, we can ship a feature. This makes it super easy to do that. But we can't actually decide what the is in an app sometimes. So we have to be very careful with when we say model, it's not purely the model layer, right? And Claude is happy to do this as well, right? You're absolutely right. If you let nature to its own devices, you will get something, but it's likely not going to be as optimized as possible for the people living there. It may or may not feed them, and it's a tangled mess, like I showed with the Jerusalem artichokes, especially in an area where the landform is succeeding, which we're going to talk about here in a minute as well. It's to its eventual balanced state. So in the eastern United States, that is a deciduous woodland forest. The land wants to be a deciduous woodlands forest. And so everything that's growing and is happening is trying to get the land to that. So every weed, everything you see in a lawn, there you're trying to fight it. It wants to be a forest. So you've seen this in the code base though too, right? So everything's a user, everything's on the order model. One model that does 17 things because no one asked to talk about the pattern before they started planting. So if we go back to the permaculture side, landforms have their own logic before we get involved. Water flows perpendicular to contour, and until gravity stops working, that's going to happen. Clay holds moisture. We have a lot of clay problems here on the East Coast, right? The rut happens in the fall, and we get a lot more deer activity. Certain areas are microclimates and take longer to warm up or cool down in the seasons. And we've made garden beds that try to fight some of that, and not in a bad way. Raised bed with fresh soil and compost mix, because that helps us avoid having to work with the clay too much and getting into soggy ground. We want to orient towards the right light exposure. So I want to get the right sun arc, and so I can move that bed in a place in the yard that gets what I need it to get. We fence the garden to keep the deer out, and they jump it, and it's an ongoing battle. So this is literally my back porch and my backyard. So the bed is our understanding of the land, like the domain, but made actionable and legible. You could argue that deer are a bug instead of a feature of the land, but Jack Spirko has a great quote that you have a garden that grows venison. So it's something that the problem is the solution is a famous quote you'll hear in permaculture. So a couple big just points here, like these are big application things to throw down before we get into zones. Name the concepts before the table, name your boundaries before you write the associations, and design from the patterns. So this is where a good understanding of common software patterns makes sense. It's not that I'm sitting there looking for the pattern to apply, but just knowing I have this kind of working knowledge of these are patterns that I can use. Okay, cool. And it's like, oh, do I need to over-engineer this right now? No, but I should be thinking about that maybe I want to have a single responsibility principle take place here. And that may influence how I'm going to think about things later. And also, like, kicking at things from different angles. So when I was at InfoEther, Rich Kilmer and I would usually do client onboarding. I would sit there with a roll of trace paper, sketching out flows and like some of the domain ideas and concepts and maybe some UI flows. And he'd be sitting there typing as fast as he could, documenting the model, and then actually creating software models from what he was documenting. So we were both coming at the same worldly domain from two different angles in software design. So this is 3.5 because zones doesn't really fit cleanly into anything. It's kind of as an overarching principle, but it is one of the main things from the pattern down. So if we think about the zones in permaculture, they are never concentric circles. This is just how we diagram it so everybody understands it, but just wanted to, you don't have to think, oh, I have to have a radius coming out of the house that is this exact thing and put things within it. So zone 0 is the home, literally the inside the house. Zone 1 is really intensive management, like the areas I visit daily. Zone 2 is moderate management, frequently, maybe weekly. Orchards, chicken coops, things of that nature, larger crop beds. Zone 3 is main production, so this would be like stuff that I plant, I leave for a season, I harvest. Zone 4 is semi-wild, I'm gonna forage, visit there. And Zone 5 is wilderness, I barely touch it. And even on small suburban properties, you will have these 5 zones. And reality is messy, right? We don't have those nice clean circles. But so if you think about, this is something that Jeremy gave me an idea for, and it's really awesome. Like if you think about the actions user takes every single session, Zone 1, that should be no click, no hunting, really easy to get to, no submenu. The quarterly admin task, we're Zone 4. It's present, it's accessible, it's kind of shoved off. That's like, resetting your personal access token in GitHub, right? You can get to it, but it's not easily there. And then the destructive action you take twice a year is Zone 5. Not hidden, but we just don't want you to trip on it, and we're probably gonna ask you, are you really, 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 really sure you wanna delete this repo? Yes, okay, bye. And on our place, this is when I did my PDC, and this was the final submission for that. The main gardens are Zone 1, up around the house and here in the center. Cows and goats are Zone 3 in the paddocks. But they can go up into the barn in Zone 1. That's where they get fed and treated. Chickens live right on the edge of 1 and 2, near the house. The tree line or 15-degree or greater slopes are all Zone 5. The pond and the riparian areas are Zone 4 because we walk past them, but we're not really going into them to do things. But there's a lot of stuff that has happened to start growing there. We have autumn olive. We have goji berry that I had planted that decided to populate itself all over the place. So we can go in there and forage that once a year. And so, but if you think about this, this is a great example of where time studies become really important. So we're talking user research now. My morning chores can be very efficient or horribly inefficient. So if I go barn, chicken, barn here, barn there, that's really inefficient. I want to start at the barn, gather everything I need, go 1, 2, 3, 4, back to the barn, drop it off, and I'm done. And if I do it right, it's 15 minutes. If I do it wrong, it's 45. So same thing happens in our software design, right? Create the record, go back. Create the related record, go back. Edit the first one, come on back. These are anti-patterns, right? So these are the kind of user things we want to think about. And these don't involve pixel design perfection. This is really where engineering should be more involved in design. So throwing back to observe, features you personally feel the pain of are definitely going to be your Zone 1. But features that are from a user you've never met, you're going to think Zone 4, but that may be their Zone 1. So these are things to kind of apply. And another Jack Spirkoism is a type 1 error. Citing things in the wrong location, especially early on. Most expensive mistake on the property is putting the house in the wrong location, but it's only second to going in and doing something like putting the roads in the wrong location. So we start with water, then access, then structures. And that's if you're doing a greenfield project, you want to make sure that those things are done right. Because if they're not, you're going to get 5 years in and be like, this barn is totally wrong. And it's a very expensive thing to move. Same thing with kind of infrastructure pain, right? Yeah, I can rewrite that, but it's a very expensive move. Last main item, pardon me, use small and slow solutions. So small and slow systems are easier to maintain than big and fast ones, and they make better use of local resources. So the system that lasts is the one that grew. Most resilient systems aren't the ones that are built fast. They're the ones that grow over time. We have incremental development. We do agile. We get feedback at each step, right? We're making sure that we've done the correct thing as we move step by step forward. If we go ahead and build the whole thing and then put it out, the first you're going to get a user hitting it being like, that's wrong, that's weird, this doesn't make sense, right? So we want to get feedback as early and often as possible. I'm going to talk about this here in a minute, but the big rewrite is clear cut. Like we're going to get into what does AI mean for all this because there's some weird overlaps now. But the big rewrite is the clear cut, right? So it removes everything fast. It looks like progress. We have a whole lot of new activity in the repository because we nuked it from orbit. But it destroys the soil structure. And so you're basically going back and having to start with nothing. Like I said, Chad Fowler's new Phoenix architecture gives us a different kind of insight into this, but I think the application is the same. So the Strangler Fig is an architectural strategy for refactoring. If you're not familiar with it, it's for replacing legacy systems by gradually rebuilding parts of that and having a shared interface. So proxy layer is routing that traffic from the old to the new. So from an end user perspective, they don't realize what's happening behind the scene. And it lets you kind of break these into meaningful pieces, bring them forward, but maintain the function. So in permaculture, or with the physical strangler fig, it literally grows up around the tree, and eventually the tree dies and decomposes, and the fig itself is all that remains. And it's this cool netting of a tree trunk thing that happens. So when the old is gone, you don't really even notice the transition because it just seems like it was there from the beginning. But it kind of serves the same purpose, it sits in the same place, yet it is new. So keeping a sustainable pace. This is a permaculture or value that's kind of mixed in here. The land can only absorb so much intervention per season. Change land into anything you want. Code base, team, company, user base. Too much intervention and people are overwhelmed and they just say, I'm out. Or the land is like, you know, you've destroyed all this and now we have to start from ground zero. We're going to have succession come back in, and I'm going to have annual weeds that are going to do a job to stabilize soil and make this safe for the rest of the forest to come back. So 2 bonuses. In any landscape, the most productive zone is the edge. So forest meets meadow, pond meets shore, things of that nature. 2 ecosystems worth of resources with conditions that neither side has on its own. So the controller is an edge. It's where HTTP meets your domain. Params come in dirty and have to become something your models can trust. You can argue fat models, fat controllers. We go back and forth on this for years, but it's really about edge design. Where is that edge in your software? Active record is an edge. The whole pattern is named after this. It's the boundary between the relational world and the object world. 2 different ways of thinking about data, and this is a hedgerow between them. And that hedgerow is a very rich living ecosystem. It's not a concrete wall. But if you ignore it, it becomes a concrete wall. Your API is an edge, right? So the Stripe is a great example of a hedgerow, right? 2 different worlds, finance and code, they meet there very clearly. The yield can be enormous. You can do a whole lot with that Stripe API. And generations of products have grown on top of that product, that edge. Third-party integration wraps around, you know, all these mocks, all these adapters and translation code. That's an edge that's not tended. And both sides change without negotiating, and all of a sudden things fall apart, right? And so that turns into a thicket or a concrete wall, and nobody's happy. Sidekick or active job or any of these also is an edge, right? So synchronous meets asynchronous. So that's another place to think about. So where do the bugs live here? Usually at that edge between the 2 as well, right? So you got that's a thing to always think about. They are work. They require edges are work. They require tending. If you ever look at hedgerow work in the UK especially, you'll notice they go through sometimes and they like literally knock it down, cut it, and do all this stuff that looks very destructive, but then it grows back even stronger. Succession planting, or succession of nature, I should say. So ecosystems move through stages. After a disturbance, a fire, a flood, a clear cut, pioneer species show up fast. They're not what the land becomes. We end up in this deciduous mixed forest here, right? But they fix nitrogen, break up compacted soil, create shade, create humus. They prepare the ground for perennials that come next. This might be a little heavy-handed. But we've been through this. 20 years we've been through this, especially on the view layer. Bless. So Prototype.js, CoffeeScript, PJAX, Sprockets, TurboLinks, Webpacker. We're kind of hanging out in the Turbo world right now. We'll see where that succeeds too, right? Maybe this is the end of the forest. Maybe we're happy. Maybe we'll get Rails 9 and it's all rewritten again. But we'll see. So, but every one of these is a pioneer species in a different way. It's moving things forward. It's enabling new functionality. It's building on what was there before, right? But we really don't miss any of them, or at least I don't. You know, they were not permanent. They were improvements, and we kept moving forward on the improvements. So the domain model, the test suite, the names of concepts, the shape of APIs, these don't churn, or they shouldn't necessarily. A user should still be a user 10 years later, right? But how the framework underneath it changes, now that can change dramatically, and this is where we get into AI. I'll go through this pretty quick because I'm at time. But AI code is a pioneer species. It's fast, opportunistic, shallow-rooted, generated, used, discard, regenerated. That's not a criticism. That is what pioneer species do. So the pioneer species breaks up the compacted soil, mines the nutrients for other plants, and prepares the way. The question just isn't, do we let pioneer species in? They're here. They're going to show up whether you want them or not. They are telling you something that's wrong about the land. So a strong perennial layer, you won't see these things growing. But a weak perennial layer, all these things show up. And this points to Chad Fowler's Phoenix architecture. So for those of you who were at RailsConf last year, Chad Fowler was in a funk. He was depressed. He was unhappy with the state of code. And somewhere around December, everything finally clicked for him. And he's been writing, it's still ongoing, this series called Phoenix Architecture, the regenerative software. So here's a quote from this that I think is kind of sums it up pretty well. And I would recommend, this could be hours of a discussion just on this. But when code is cheap to generate, preserving it at all costs becomes irrational. Yet we still need systems that are reliable, secure, comprehensible, and long-lived. The solution is not to fight ephemerally, but to design around it. This means shifting what we treat as permanent. Not implementation, but interfaces. Not code, but behavior. Not files, but evaluations. Not ownership, but stewardship. In other words, the system is an asset. Code is just a consumable input. I really can't say enough good things about this, as how it's changed my thinking about how AI is going to impact us and how I'm going to interact with it as a designer and a developer. So your job is not going to prevent succession. Succession is going to happen. Your job is to plan the perennials carefully, know which species your code base are annuals and perennials, and stop being precious about them. Maybe interfaces, behaviors, evaluations, and stewardships are the new perennials, and the code underneath is burned down and regenerated repeatedly. The forest does need occasional fire. But I want to come back real quick to the farm we didn't rebuild. When we moved to the property, it would have been really easy to tear it out, refence everything. Money was no object if I bought Bitcoin back in the day. But we didn't. So partly because we couldn't afford to, and partly because we didn't know enough yet. And mostly looking back, because the land was already telling us things, and we had not earned the right to overrule it yet. We waited years before building this greenhouse. We had learned about the property, we learned what we could have done, where we actually integrated and worked with things, where the garden was sit. And your code bases you inherit are the same. Someone else's horse farm, someone else's fences, but someone else's learnings and someone else's wisdoms. You can rip it out or you can observe through a season. Watch where the water flows. Notice what's already growing. Find the parts of the property that work and the parts that need to be tended differently. You're not a builder, or we are sometimes, but building is a thing that happens very occasionally on a farm. Mostly what happens on a farm is tending. So walk the land in the morning, pull the invasives, tend the edges, let the pioneers do their work, plant the perennials carefully. And it's also a farm. Permaculture principles transfer because they really aren't about farming. They're about how we live in systems and how those living systems persist. Your code base is a living system, so treat it like one, and please walk the land in the morning. Thank you.